Good morning. Welcome to How You Share Your Story, Tips for Creative Writing. I'm Dr. Tanis MacDonald, and I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Laurier's Waterloo and Brantford campuses are located on the shared traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and symbolizes the agreement to share, protect our resources, and to not engage in conflict. From the Haldeman Proclamation of October 25th, 1784, this territory is described as 6 miles deep from each side of the Grand River, beginning at Lake Erie and extending in the proportion to the head of that said river, which them and their prosperity are to enjoy forever. The proclamation was signed by the British with their allies, the Six Nations, after the American Revolution. Despite being the largest reserve demographically in Canada, those nations now reside on less than 5% of this original territory. Laurier's Kitchener, Waterloo, Brantford, and Milton campuses are close to 18 First Nations communities and 12 Métis councils. The Six Nations of the Grand River and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations are only a 15-minute drive from our Brantford campus. Wilfrid Laurier strives to improve its relationship with the land and the people with whom we share it. As such, it is important to further our understanding of the long-standing history that has brought Laurier to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. Welcome to How to Share Your Stories, Tips for Creative Writing. I'm Dr. Tanis MacDonald, and I am here today to talk about writing, to talk about exactly what it means to share your story. And I have with me an alumni of Laurier and a friend and colleague, Jenny Heijun Wills. And I'm just finding Jenny's biography. Hi, Jenny. Jenny Heijun Wills was born in Seoul, South Korea, raised in Southern Ontario, and currently lives in mild stomping grounds of Winnipeg, Manitoba. She's the author of Older Sister, Not Necessarily Related, a memoir which received the 2019 Hillary Weston Writers Trust Award for Nonfiction and the 2020 Eileen McTavish Sykes Award for Best First Book. She has a new book out right now called Everything and Nothing at All that just came out this year. And Jenny is a professor of English at the University of Winnipeg. Welcome, Jenny.
Hi, Tanis. Thanks so much for having me. It dawns on me that we did the real switcheroo because I was raised in the KW area, and now I'm out here in Winnipeg. I'm so excited to introduce you, given our long sort of both professional and friendly past. Tanis MacDonald is the author of Straggle, Adventures in Walking While Female, and 6 other books of poetry and nonfiction. She is twice the winner of the Malahat Review's Open Seasons Award in 2021 for her essay on female friendship and music fandom, but and in 2025 for her essay on adoption and ancestry. Her next book, Tall Grass Girl, with commas in between, I should add, it doesn't appear when I say it, is forthcoming in 2026. So thank you so much.
Great to be here. Great to be here with you. And we thought we would sort of broach some questions that come up when we talk to people about writing a nonfiction, particularly personal essays or memoirs, and this idea of sharing your story. So I've got a question. I know that a lot of people want to share their story, like they have the urge to, and I would say that is true of many of our attendees today, but they feel hampered by circumstances. And sometimes those circumstances are things like a family secret or an unpopular life choice that they themselves have made and then want to parse and take apart, right? Or a truth, any kind of truth that is hard to articulate because it's complex. And being a human is complex. So I want to know what your approach has been to confronting these kinds of things that could potentially stop you from writing them, and how do you get over those kinds of hurdles?
No, that's a great question, and one that I think people often pose because the majority of people in this world care about the other individuals in their lives. And especially we talk about the ethics of storytelling, um, who has the right to tell a story, when of course there's a large cast of characters in it. And I think maybe that's what what enables me or encourages me to do this work is in fact thinking of writing nonfiction through a lot of the craft tools of writing fiction. And so by that I mean I don't necessarily see a person in my life as just a neutral individual in the text. It's really important to me, at least, to consider them as a character. My speaker also, she's a character, and she shifts and changes depending on the circumstance. But to really be deliberately aware of um, that this representation that is inspired by and based on real life people in my life is in fact still a constructed literary being. And so with that comes, you know, the kind of generosities that we give all of our fictional characters, nuance, complexity, generosity at times, but also just the understanding that, you know, an entirely good character or an entirely, you know, traumatized character or an entirely bad character is quite flat. And so approaching writing nonfiction through the same literary craft, I think that we afford other modes of representation is one way that I do that. How about you? Because we write about very similar things.
Yeah.
For folks maybe who are unfamiliar, both Tanis and I write about adoption, and being adopted individuals from different circumstances. But it's difficult knowledge, right?
It's difficult knowledge. It's difficult to, I mean, particularly with that particular narrative, it's hard to find a narrative to hang it on because there are like all kinds of cliches you want to avoid. And sometimes you want to say,
Mhm,
you know, this is cliche because it's true, and this is cliche because it isn't true, right? And
mhm,
so when you're writing from real life, you want to pick up the things that you think need to be said about a particular condition or a particular event, and also know what, be clear about what other people might be thinking about that condition or event and push back against what you think is inaccurate knowledge, right? I think too, when I think about something, a hard truth, in Straggle, there's I'm going to point out a particular essay for people who have read Straggle or who want to read it. um, I kind of cracked up over COVID, like the first couple of months. And I had this sort of rolling panic attack. And when I finally got it under control, and I mean, we are talking about weeks here, right? When I finally got it under control, I went, okay, under control. Now, no one can know about this. It was going to be a big secret. And then I started talking, I started opening up to a couple of people, and I said, oh, I really had a really hard time and bad panic attacks. And they said, oh, me too. And I said, me too? What? I thought this was special and unusual and shameful. And it turns out the more people I talked to, the more people said, oh, yeah, couldn't get out of bed for a week, right? And so that's when I went, okay, this clearly needs to be part of the book, right? So to take the thing of which I was so ashamed and say, maybe we shouldn't be ashamed of this. Maybe there's really
mhm,
good reasons for for not doing well in a crisis for a little while,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
And so I had to find the courage to do that. And I found the courage by talking to other people who were so compassionate. And I thought, if these people are so compassionate, I think readers would also be compassionate. And I also want to give readers a chance to read that and go, oh, that happened to me too. Maybe it wasn't so bad. Or maybe it wasn't so
mhm,
shameful. Because, of course, the
mhm,
feelings were not good. But
mhm, mhm.
so
Right.
yeah, that's one of those things. Sometimes we're hampered by circumstances because we've told that
Mhm,
certain things are taboo to talk about or to write about.
mhm.
And
Well, I feel,
overcoming.
oh, excuse me.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say what you're describing feels a little bit like that sweet spot that we look for as memoirists or as nonfiction, creative nonfiction writers. And that is finding a subject that is universal enough, or it could be a vague topic that's universal enough to connect with a general audience, but also finding that perspective or that POV, and it could be aesthetic, that makes your representation the important one to read and write. So finding the right balance of connection to an imagined reader, but also, um, I guess, specialness in what you can bring to the table.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. You know what, I read something this week that I really want to ask you about because it just kind of made my eyes like saucers. I couldn't believe it when I read it. So I'm reading this article by the UK author Zadie Smith, who is primarily known as a novelist, but of course she writes very short fiction as well, and she's an award-winning essayist. And she was writing about her writing a personal essay method. And she said she writes the first line of an essay, and then the last line, and then she fills in everything in between. Now, this struck me as admirable if you can do it, but also impossible for me to do. And I wanted to ask you about your reaction to that, and what kind of starting point do you tend to begin from? I mean, we just talked about that sweet spot about finding something, but is that the starting point, or is that something that comes a little later in the process?
Gosh, I mean, to compare oneself or even to think of oneself in the same breath as Sadie Smith is kind of hubris to begin with, I think. Um, when I sit down to write an essay, usually I think very broadly about theme, and it's memory that comes first. So the way that I teach nonfiction and think about nonfiction is the traditional way, like scene, then exploration and reflection kind of thing. And scene is the juiciest part for me to write. So whether it's anecdote or intertext or whatever, I just start to spill out memories related to a particular topic that I think might be relevant. And I'm not saying that I think of these topics on my own. I'm supported by like a large literary team that tells me what topics are also of interest to people. And then the memories come, and then I fill it in with um, I guess I would say public intellectual thought, sometimes scholarly thought, not in the traditional sort of peer-reviewed sense, but using a lot of those skills that I acquired while I was a student at Laurier. I use that kind of stuff to fill out the essays, but it definitely starts with memory. Those are the funnest things to write. I think they're the fastest things to write also. But what about you? What's your process like?
Um, I think, similarly, I think, and I think it's important to think about working associatively, right? So when I was writing
Mhm.
Straggle, I wanted to write about my personal experience of walking for a number of the essays, and I talk about a lot of things in Straggle, but for the walking ones, I did that. I wanted like every experience I could
Mhm.
think of, every memory I could think of about walking. Um, so yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with my background as a poet. So even when I write
Mhm.
prose, I do think in terms of images and in terms of how to connect all of those images, either stylistically or in other ways, right? Or in like in form.
Mhm.
So yeah, so there's that. And I thought I was
Mhm.
going to say something else, and it slipped my mind. Um,
The
but I
mind
think
of
it.
a poet is a complex thing, so this is
Oh,
it's very slippery.
I know what I was going to say. And as you talk about having people in your life who suggest to you, maybe you want to say something about XYZ. I had a friend of mine read most of Straggle in manuscript, and then she said, "There's nothing here about your mother." And I immediately was defensive and said, don't tell me that I have to write an essay about my mother. And then, of course, she was right. So I wrote an essay about my mother, right? And that was my mother and walking. And that, of course, turned out to be, a very rich vein that I had been ignoring for a variety of reasons, probably because my mother appears in Out of Line about 1,000 times. And I thought, maybe I need to just relax on writing about her. But and I think really my colleague and friend was right that that was a particular piece that needed to happen in that book that I was ignoring for reasons that had nothing to do with the book.
No, that's great to have supporters or colleagues or friends who can read things. I never have the courage to show any of my writing outside of my team until it comes out. But then there's a
Well,
different kind of panic that comes with that because it's like, well, maybe they're wrong, but they never are.
yeah, yeah.
But
Who's your team? So when you describe your
so
team.
so it's like like people in my professional sort of orbit that way. And maybe it's also because I feel guilty about asking for people's time in those ways. But it would be um, first like my literary agent who so I realize that it's integral to be reading and reading in the genres and modes in which we're writing, but also outside of those genres and modes. However, one thing that I do notice is that I tend to be inspired by books then that are already published and that are of the past, and folks who are in the publishing world know what's coming up, and so I find it helpful to lean on those individuals a lot. So my literary agents, but then the most helpful voices would be I have a team of editors at my press who really it's quite astounding because I think I know what I'm doing, which is probably the theme of my life, only to be thwarted and be told I don't know what I'm doing, and actually this is the other thing that I'm doing. But they're so kind and thoughtful that they never tell me in the moment, like, hello, like this is so obvious, like why we're suggesting this. They kindly suggest adjustments. So for my last collection, it's 5 essays. It originally began as 9 essays. They kindly sort of collapsed it into 5 or directed me on how to do that. And then when I was touring the book the first time, I was in the middle of an interview and I was like, oh, that's why. And I was like, wow, this is like so inventive and so clever. But it totally wasn't me. And so you need to give flowers to like the people who read and see the holes, because in our own minds, it's like, yeah, my life is so common sense. It's so obvious to me what's important and what isn't, but it's those outside eyes that really are the ones that can get to the core of what a text truly is about, whether we like it or not, I guess. Let me ask you some questions because I know that you have a much longer and illustrious writing career than have I. Um, and I realize coming from other genres that these modes of representation impact the way that you think about nonfiction. What do you bring with you? You mentioned a little bit from poetry. What do you bring with you? And I ask this because a lot of individuals that I encounter in nonfiction classrooms say, you know, I've been journaling my whole life. So I have all of this stuff. I'm just going to put it together and it'll be a book kind of thing. What do you bring to nonfiction? And maybe what would you say to folks who have thousands of pages? What can you do next, I guess, with
Yeah.
them?
I think journaling is a valuable first step, right? Because
Mhm.
the act of sort of moving your hand across the page and getting into the actual labor of doing it, I think is really fair.
Mhm. Yeah.
And at the same time, that's like batting practice. That's not the game, right? It's good to do it. It's good to have it. It'll make you a stronger writer. It'll make you understand the effort behind it. But of course, it isn't a book. It isn't going to the World Series, right? And
Mhm.
so it's a place to begin to see those pieces of a narrative coming together.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm an inveterate notebook keeper. Here's my latest. There it is, a little mushroom notebook, right? And so I do that kind of preliminary work, and I would never sneeze at it, but it is preliminary work, right? And then you have to say after, look at it and say, okay, what here is an actual story, and what is just me having a terrible day,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So when we think about this, how to share your story, it's very, very helpful to figure out what the story actually is,
Mhm.
right? And sometimes I have to say to people in class, that was an event that happened, but it's not a story, not yet. right? So there's also a kind of audacity to taking an event in your life and saying, this is a story, this is important, and here are the reasons why, right? And that means that often that you have to take sort of that kernel that came up in your journal writing, push everything else away and develop around the kernel. And so you were talking about research techniques that we learn as academics, but you don't need to be an academic, but you do need to be a really curious person. You need to know, you need to say, okay, here's this kernel. What about this aspect of it? What about the history of it? What about the actual meaning of the word? Who else has written about this, right? And start to build, build up around that, right? So having what Rudyard Kipling called insatiable curiosity in The Elephant's Child, having insatiable curiosity is a really good thing for anyone who wants to tell their story, because you have to place your story somewhere in a context, right? If it's a family story, in a story of heritage, or perhaps a history of those peoples, right? If it is, a story about something that happened to you, what about the social history of those kinds of events, and where does your event fit into it, right? So the whole idea is that it's a story, number one, with a context, and number two, with the kind of audacity it takes to think of something that happened to you as a story, right?
Yeah, that allegory of like batting practice is hilarious. First of all, I secretly have a book about baseball inside of me because I'm a huge baseball fan, which is kind of surprising based on my vibe. Um, but also, I go to the batting cages when I need to get aggression out too, like just like the physical act of
Yeah.
doing something, physically somewhat powerful, I guess. So that's also the time for journaling, is like to get out some of those like chaotic emotions, I think, before they can be sort of scaffolded into
Yeah.
something. Um, I think about, you know, so my experience with journaling, which is like very inconsistent, my ADHD brain cannot be reliable on journaling, though, is that it is mostly reflection, and it's mostly the kind of mm, working through emotional experiences in the ways that in nonfiction, like we're not trying to necessarily do all the time. Like we're not necessarily trying to say, my speaker was thinking this all the time, and this was her experience, or this was their experience. And so that's the end of this particular anecdote. Um, just like in all narrative writing, it's about showing and then allowing your reader to meet you at least halfway, I think, and parsing out what is the purpose and the benefit of those particular passages. And so, yes, journaling, I think I always say to people, it's a good thing to like, kick your memory into gear about the things that had happened, but it really cannot necessarily stand alone because it's not it's not the kind of interesting writing that too many readers want to look at, but also it deprives you of writing through image, I think, and writing through, I don't really write metaphorically that much in like a journal situation. It's more sort of
Right.
thoughts and events. And so, yeah, I
I
don't
mean,
know.
I mean, sometimes I think journaling is like clearing the cache, right?
Mhm.
So I write, a number of pages of really heartfelt nonsense, and then I get to the thing I really want to say, right?
Mhm.
And so I'm
Mhm.
not coming up with like fantastic bon mots and great metaphors for pages and pages.
Mhm.
That happens
Yeah.
just sort of about after 10 or 20 pages, and I go, aha,
Mhm.
that's it.
Mhm.
That's the piece that I want to pursue, right? And so it means that I know I have to, get rid of everything else that is going on in my
Mhm.
brain,
Mhm.
right? And then I say, there's the real story right there,
Mhm.
right? And that
Mhm.
takes practice, right? And journaling is good practice for that, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think of a practical tip for people. If I know we're going to offer tips. So here's my tip. I know Jenny says that she doesn't show her writing to anyone beyond her literary team. I do. I have a number of friends that I can send them something and say, I'm struggling with this on page 5. Can you have a look at it? Right. And they will, do that. You have to be careful about this. You can't just like dump it on them. You have to say, can you look at something for me today? Right. And they say, how long? And I say 6 pages. Yes, I can look at it. Right. And I do the same for them. Right. And I think when you first start out, this is a very good practice to get into because it makes you accountable to someone. It gives you practice being seen as when in process, right? With a draft that isn't perfect, with something that you are struggling with. So, my friend will get back to me and say, either, I don't think there's anything wrong on page 5. I think you're overthinking it, which is possible. Or they might say, I see the problem here, and I think it's X, Y, Z. You need to do more A, B, C, right? Mm-hmm. And then I'll go, thanks. I wouldn't have thought of that on my own. Thank you. And I go away and I do it. I do the research they suggested, or I write into something, or I make it more detailed, or etc. Right? And that does make you vulnerable because my writing colleague isn't going to say to me, this is crap, but they are going to say, I don't think this is ready. There's something more that needs to be done. Right. And so that's a vulnerable position to be in, but it's also valuable. Right. And of course, I do the same for them. Right. And so you have to, so it's very good. It's like gold. You said send flowers to everyone who helps you. It's like, or give them actual, material help as well. Right. To say that you can be colleagues together and think about these ideas together and respect each other's work in process. Right.
Yeah, I mean, if you can have those circles, absolutely, because it is extremely scary to like go out in the world and just drop a book in bookstores that you haven't necessarily had the time or the space to. I mean, obviously our books get focus grouped, so there is that,
Yeah.
but still, so it's a little bit scary that way. You mentioned just briefly ago, and maybe this is connected to the idea of friends editing or looking over our work also. But when one turns to nonfiction, maybe for the first time, there's that little bit of that. Um, I don't want to pathologize it necessarily, but that I don't know, disembodiedness or sociopathy that one thinks their story is like special enough and is unique enough. And then on the other hand, there are people who are just like, oh, my life is so uninteresting. How could anyone want to read about it? Which is also not the case. So what gives someone, do you think, the audacity is what you said, I would say recklessness, maybe, to become a life writer, let's just say, whether it's a personal essay, memoir, or whatever. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think something's interesting if you invest in it, right? The essay that I wrote that won the Open Seasons Awards called Mondegreen Girls, and it's about when you're a teenager, you sort of worship, your basic music stars, right? And often misconstrue their lyrics because you're a kid, right? So this
Hopefully
is about how
misconstrued.
this is about how I had a friend. The base of this essay is I had a friend who was a huge Elton John fan, and she always misheard his lyrics and was walking around singing, a form of Benny and the Jets that is, kind of unrepeatable. But so that's what I mean by that's an event, but it's not a story, right? So in order to write that, I had to say that it matters who teenage girls pay attention to. It matters how they share their fandom with their friends. It's absolutely a moment of intimacy between adolescent girls, right? And then it turned into this whole thing about female fandom, the force of female fandom, what it means to misunderstand lyrics, and that how that is a bonding experience rather than an exchanging experience. Elton John and sexuality, and then it ended up being in part about both of us dealing with like an early death of someone, right? So all of those things came together, and I have to say that's interesting, not because it happened to me and her, but it's interesting because pop culture fandom is such a strong pull. And people don't need to be Elton John fans to like this. They're going to transpose their own, their own fandom onto this, right? And all the strangeness of the fandom, dressing like the stars, singing the songs all the time, having a friend who's as big a fan as you are, right? And that's a huge piece of adolescent culture and of girls' culture. And I wanted to say, because I hear about male fandom all the time, and I thought, no, I want girls' fandom in here, girls' fandom in the 1970s.
Oh, that's so interesting. I think for me, like I never thought that my life was interesting enough to write about. And a lot of the subjects that I write about in my new collection feel very common sense for people who've read. A lot of it is about being Asian Canadian and whatnot and different journeys, but particularly through an adopted person's lens. But it feels so run of the mill, or it feels so obvious to me. However, I like to think also that the unique thing that someone can bring to the table is aesthetic. It could be style. It could be the way that the text is presented. It doesn't need to necessarily be the subject matter that is original or never heard about before. I mean, there are millions of memoirs about parents aging, for instance, but it's the ones, for me at least, when I read them, that stand out because of an interesting arrangement or a very unique tone or a particular use of language or an experimental way of expression that stand out. So the point of the life writing for me can also be the craft. It doesn't have to only be the content. And so that's something that I'm thinking about. I'm writing what I swear is going to be my last nonfiction. I'm just like over this mode completely,
I don't think
but
you're
people,
supposed to be saying that in a webinar where we're
no,
talking about
because
how to
no,
share our
straight up,
story.
because I'm transitioning into fiction. My editor says it's time. But I promised one more nonfiction. And in this one, I'm thinking about structure like from the get-go. And it's the first time that I've approached writing a book from a very bookiness approach, as opposed to here are my like rambling thoughts, and like someone will help me, organize them into something meaningful. I'm really thinking about craft at the head of this one, and it's very exciting, and I find that it writes the book faster. I'm an extremely fast writer also. I should say that when I say I don't share my work with friends, it's because their reading is too slow. Um, and so with everything and nothing at all, I signed the contract in May of 2023, and it was released in August 2024 with Knopf, which is extremely fast because I
It is
submitted
fast.
it on proposal. I hadn't written the book yet. And maybe this is something there might be questions about the process of publishing a nonfiction text. With the first book, I submitted it with 50% of the book written, and I had a couple of years to work back and forth with copy edits and whatnot. With this new book, I was receiving copy edits as I was still writing other chapters. So I didn't see the entire text
Yeah.
as a whole um, until galleys, which is also quite frightening for someone like me. But I was happy in the end with the result. Um, but yeah, I'm a very fast writer and a very like, again, I think it's like my particular neurospicy like quality is that I can't sit with it for too long or I'll get bored
Mm,
with the topic. It's just like now I'm writing this essay and in 2 days it'll be done kind of thing.
mm.
Yeah.
I'm, you know, I'm, hmm, I can do that. I
Hmm.
tend not to, though. or I do.
I don't recommend it.
I will think about a topic for a long time
Mhm.
and then write fairly quickly, but I will have done a lot of research and a lot of thinking about it. And then,
Mhm.
and I've
Mhm.
also been in that position where I've had, it's already, in process, and I've
Yep.
sent my sent my editor, wait, I have this other short chapter, this other short essay that I think will go between this one and this one, right? Because there is something about a deadline that makes everyone a little neurospicy, I think.
Yes.
There is a question in the chat that I want to
Oh,
look
amazing.
at and maybe give you a chance to answer, because I think in some ways I've spoken about how that works for me. So it's from Patricia Goff, and she asks, hi, Patricia. Tanis talked about the difference between an event and a story. I would love to hear more about the difference and how you transform the experience of an event into a story. Do you
Mhm.
want to take a crack at that? Because I think I just
Sure.
talked about Lawn to Green Girls. So
Yeah. So how I would think about this, thank you for your question, Patricia, was it? Sorry,
yep.
I can't see the chat for some reason. Um, I think the way I would think of this is an event is maybe something that happens to a bunch of characters, maybe, whether they're based on figures in your real life or not. But a story to me is when you can name what is at stake for at least one of the characters if you're going to have like a main character or a protagonist in this work. And you can articulate the same kind of tensions, like the ebbs and flows that we see in all other kinds of writing. And so for me, it's like digging into that toolbox of literary craft, but also literary criticism and what can portray to a reader something at stake for the speaker and to make it valuable for the reader to experience. Um, so maybe an example in everything I have one chapter that is about um, reading because I've spent my entire life reading books and collecting books, also like living amongst books. Like my house is kindling. I do not recommend visiting. It is like a fire hazard, 100%. Um, but of course, we can read a summary of someone's life amongst books, like big deal, I guess, really. But what I think I wanted to portray as at stake for my speaker in that chapter is that she didn't know how to be an Asian person herself, being adopted by a white family. And so she was coming to a realization of herself through reading. And so, yes, the event or like the long extended event is a life amongst books. But what is at stake for her is like, how can she shape identity, not necessarily through the books, by identifying with the characters in the books, but in a like grander scheme of things. So that's, I guess, how I would think of the difference between just like a thing that happened and why it's important.
I think too of Jen Suk-Vong Lee's essay, How Anne of Green Gables Saved My Life, right? As a kind of way to think about, um, sure, lots of people have read Anne of Green Gables, right?
Mhm.
And she has a particular take on Anne of Green Gables. But again, what is at stake?
Right.
What is the difference here? And she's talking about reading it at a particular time of her life. Also, reading as a Chinese Canadian,
Mhm.
etc. Right? So that was I thought that was a great essay, and it's about and I think
Even though it's
it's
called The Orphan, aren't you high-key triggered by that? I
oh,
was.
I am super triggered by Anne of Green Gables, and we can talk about that later.
Uh, but the title of the essay also, I'm just like, "Oh, we're doing what now?"
But
Just
what I
kidding.
liked about it was that I mean, I'm glad you brought up this idea of a chapter about a life among books, right? Because I'll pretty much read anything where people talk about their relationship to
Mhm,
reading,
mhm.
right? So
Right.
when we think about it's also important to think about, who do you imagine reading
Mhm,
this,
mhm, mhm,
right? Who's
mhm,
going to be sympathetic to the fact that a young woman had a
mhm,
book to
mhm,
save her life, right?
mhm,
And I thought, I'm sympathetic to that. I want to read about that. And and it makes me think about what books were important to me, etc. Right.
Right.
So
Absolutely.
for Mondegreen Girls, I was absolutely writing it for the uncool, geeky, 13-year-old me and everyone like that,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I know everyone
Mm-hmm.
goes through that kind of a stage, and but depends on what you're writing. For particular
Mm-hmm.
things, sometimes when people are telling a family story, they're telling it, imagining their family reading it, which is one way to do it, right?
Wow.
And I
Yeah.
know, and other
Can't
people
relate. It couldn't be
and other
me.
people write saying, I never want my family to read
Right.
this,
That part.
right?
Yeah.
That a lot of people don't write their family story until their parents have passed away, because
Mm-hmm.
then they have permission to, like, they can give themselves permission to do so. So yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
thinking about who's your ultimate reader is, I think, an
Mm-hmm.
interesting thing. I'm not sure I always arrive at who I think the ultimate reader is,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a good thing to think about.
Right. So I'm working through this concept right now. This is how I workshop ideas, is through talks and like sort of verbal presentations. I'm working through this concept about the unreliable reader of life writing. Right now, we often talk obviously about the unreliable speaker in first person narrative writing, but I'm thinking a lot about unreliable readers to our life stories and how to navigate that person and not center them in the writing process. And by that, I mean people who, particularly for multiply marginalized speakers representing authors from those communities, who are frequently saying that nonfiction from, let's say, people of color is either too political or not political enough, or too aesthetic or not aesthetic enough. And we do this within our own communities also. So it's not just like an outside in kind of thing. So I'm thinking about that reader a lot. I was thinking about different readers for each book that I wrote, and it's increasingly becoming broader, I think. But that just comes with the alarm of more people reading one's work, I think, and realizing that publishing a life story is like a very public facing act.
Yeah.
And depending on your press, whether they do fact checking, whether they do like legal goes through obviously all of the books to make sure that libel and slander are things that are hopefully not going to appear. But speaking of books though, about or texts about reading, I don't know if you've seen Dion Brand's Salvage, but it is like
Yes.
required reading for any literary studies course, but also any writer. Like it's just well, I mean, obviously, like hello, but yeah.
Well, Brand's the best, and Salvage, I think, is
Mhm.
probably her best work yet,
It
right?
was it was a stunner. I was like, oh crap! Like Dion Brand has a book that's coming out about reading, and I have this like measly chapter about reading. Like I'll just go like, I don't know, dispose of myself now, like because they came out in the same like season, same like press. So
Okay, we've got two things we need to do. Patricia
okay.
had a follow-up question
Oh
about your chapter about reading, and I think that's in Everything and Nothing at All, right?
yeah,
She wanted to know where to find it, so it's in Jenny's new book, Everything and Nothing at All.
looks like it
And
just came out in paperback,
yay,
so it's
excellent.
cheaper.
Okay, and we have a question in the chat. As you prepare for your writing to be published, whoa, where to go? As you prepare for your writing to be published, especially intimate and vulnerable nonfiction works, how do you manage fear or anticipation of
Mm,
how readers will perceive you?
that's a great
Um,
question.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, to be honest, so
You
first
go.
of all, I do two things. So I speak with my psychiatrist a lot about these things. Thankfully, he was an English undergrad, so he's like super into talking about these kinds of things. But when it came to So my first book is a memoir about adoption reunion and going back to Korea and reuniting with my Korean family, and the complexities of that. And I knew in my heart, I was a little bit intimidated by readers who might be of the mindset that, saving, you know, orphans of color from around the world is like a magnanimous gesture. So, what I did is I wrote a preface to the text that was a little bit of a disclaimer that was like, how like they always say an epigraph is like a punch before the bell? Like, I felt that this preface was a little bit of a way to say, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of everyone. I'm not trying to get you up in your feelings. Like, you can keep that for yourself. But also, I'm trying to let you know in this text how truth, that unwritten commitment between the life writer and the reader, is not as simple as we might think it is. And that for some authors and therefore their speakers, truth is this fleeting and unattainable thing. And so, if I could, maybe I'll just read this. It's very, very
Yeah,
short.
do it,
The
do it.
preface. Is that okay? Is that so boring for everyone?
No,
I guess
no,
you
do it.
can't participate because of the Q&A thing, so I'll just do it
I'm
anyway.
speaking for them. Do it.
Awesome. So the preface to this sets up the book as one that is hopefully challenging genre expectations of truth telling in life writing and difficult knowledge. So my speaker says, these stories are not all mine. Some of them, in fact, belong to no one at all, but are the fantasies that seem to flower so naturally from the mouths of those of us who have grown lives out of half facts, wishful thinking, and outright lies, who piece themselves together from the residue of lost records, from withheld or secreted records, whose orphanages and agencies have been evasively destroyed by fire and flood or by shame. We are told there's nothing left of the people or places or lives we might have had. We're told they, and our knowledge of them, do not belong to us. They never did. And so, these stories are nothing special, only echoes and memories and alibis, but they are all I have. So writing a sort of mini disclaimer to what was to come was a way for me to feel a little bit stronger. I know it's like a really defensive and passive aggressive thing to do, but it did make me
Oh, I
feel
don't
a
think
lot
so.
stronger coming in with the book afterwards.
Yeah. You know what? I don't think that's passive aggressive at all. I
Okay,
think
thank
it
you.
is,
You're
no,
nice.
I think it is saying these are the terms under which I'm about to
Mhm,
tell you things.
mhm,
And if you don't like those terms, maybe this isn't the book for you. Right.
mhm.
And,
But hopefully you've already paid for it. No,
yeah,
just kidding.
and
Just kidding.
and no shame, this might not be a book
Yeah,
for everyone, but if you're
totally.
open to thinking of it in this way, then I've got more of that coming in the those coming pages,
Yeah.
right? Because if you're looking for complete answers for why things are the way they are, well, it's not going to
Well,
be in the book, but I'm going to tell you
right.
my perspective on it, right?
And I don't think that's the point of nonfiction. I don't think nonfiction is meant to teach us or tell us what we're to think. It's to inspire us to ask more questions, or at least not good nonfiction, as I think.
Well, speaking of questions, we have another one in
Oh,
the chat from someone who says, I'm currently interviewing my dad about his life with the hope of creating a biography. As I listen to his stories, I recognize that I have commentary about things that happen in his life. I'll bet you do. We all do. Do you have any advice about writing do you have any advice about from what point of view to write the story?
mm,
I was just working as an editor on a manuscript that is, yes, in this case, a father and son, and the father's stories are a huge part of it. So the son
mm,
narrates, and then the father's stories come in italics. And then
mhm.
there's always reaction to the stories, right? Because the stories get told over and over. And one thing that the narrator says is, what does he want me to get out of this? Why does he keep repeating this story? And then he also keeps track of changes in the story.
Mhm,
And then there's
mhm,
a moment where where the story changes so dramatically that we're like, is this the same story? Right. And
mhm,
so the narrator, through his point of view, takes us along with this strange journey of what's happening in this oft-told, repeated, and sometimes changeable story. So I would say you have the option there to, put a first person, have the father's story first person, and also have the story of hearing the story of living with the story, which would be the narrators, the interviewer, right? But I would say don't be afraid to put yourself in that, right? And it doesn't have to be a traditional biography where you go, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. It can start with that strange, a strange story and be built around that. So I would say, think of form, right? Think of form, what it is to listen to a story and hear it over and over again. Jenny, do you want to say more?
Yeah, I mean, the question is a really helpful one. It reminds me of Jordan Abel's Nishka, like a beautiful memoir that came out a handful of years ago that's about stories that are relayed from parents, and then also the stories that can't be relayed. And the speaker in that case does the most reliable thing, I think. And they say, I should have memory of this, but I don't. Or I should have the knowledge, but I don't. And it's a story about residential schools surviving, second generation residential school experiences. And that's part of the theme and the topic of the text is like the way that meta narrative, so the way thinking about the textiness of the text is a reflection of like what is fragmented and lost in residential. Think of Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. She's a literary journalist, and she wrote this. She also wrote that book, Cast. Both of her books are like 10 million pages long. She's so brilliant.
I've
Not
heard
that
of
length
Cast,
is
but
a
not
sign of brilliance, but
not the other
so
one.
they're the same vibe. I think she interviews like 1,000 people, and she does this really cool thing. I encourage looking at it. She writes largely in the third person perspective of the people that she's interviewed, but she uses different degrees of omniscience and closeness to different characters. And so one would think often that the third person is such a distanced, because your speaker isn't interacting as a character, usually with other characters, POV. But for each of the main characters that she's looking at, her third person speaker changes to reflect characterization. So one of the main characters is a doctor. So her third person speaker is extremely like detail oriented, very factual. One of the main characters is this kind of sort of dreamer kind of character. So the third person speaker in those sections is very allegorical and makes gestures to certain kind of text that would make sense to that speaker. So there are amazing opportunities in the third person, I think, to do some extremely brilliant characterizing work and to really flex those creative muscles in ways that we wouldn't necessarily think, because we think of biography maybe as like, as Hannah says, like, and this happened, then this happened, then this happened. But I would really say turn to literary journalists to see how third person and interview can really be done in a super cool way, I think.
And I would also draw people's attentions to our reading recommendations,
Oh yeah.
because a little further up in the chat, I'm just looking at them now, and I'm thinking of all the ways that these writers found different ways to tell their story, right? And sometimes it's in form, right? And I think of Idang Trung's fantastic Land Bridge, right, in which she tells an immigration story and an illness story and a family story, and really, a story about tragedy and history and art, and she just gets it all in there. And it's an astounding book if you haven't read it. Similarly, Kyle McClear's Unearthed seems to be a family biography, but it's also a biography about, a book about things that were hidden from her, things she has to imagine because she can't know for sure. And I have my eye on the time. And I have posted, I don't think it goes to everyone in the chat. So Laurier Research, if you can repost my, there it is. Great, thank you very much. I'm gonna share my screen because I know that we want to think about getting started. And this is from the writer and teacher George Ella Lyon, who is a Kentucky writer, and she began a project called the Where I'm From Project. And I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Where I'm From grew out of my response to a poem from Stories I Ain't Told Nobody Yet by my friend, the Tennessee writer Joe Carson. All of the people pieces, as Joe calls them, are based on things folks actually said, and number 22 begins, I want to know when you get to be from a place, right? So if we're thinking about situating ourselves in our story, many of our stories are kind of fractured and all over the place. And this is an exercise that you can do to start getting in touch with some of those pieces, right? Jenny and I have talked about, things things you don't know, stories that you relate to, stories that you want to keep distanced from. And here we have Joe's speaker, one of those people that doesn't have roots like trees, tells us, I am from Interstate 40 and I am from the work my father did. So your task, should you choose to accept it, is to write a short Where I'm From piece. And you can see that this is Georgiella Lyons, and she begins with, I am from clothespins, from Clorox and carbon tetrachloride. I'm from the dirt under the back porch, black, glistening. It tasted like beets. I'm not going to read the whole thing because you can copy the link in the chat. But the task, don't worry about being poetic, worried about, concentrate on detail, on what you remember about where you're from. You don't have to write it in poem form, though feel free. You can write it in a little chunky paragraph, right? In which you list where you're from, but avoid things like saying, blunt statements like, I come from a Scottish Canadian family, right? Because that just gets us into my life is so dull and uninteresting. I want you to reach for these interesting details, these weird juxtapositions, right? These odd lived contradictions, right? So we get this kind of piece of where I'm from, and that is going to spur you on to think about different perspectives on what your story actually is, right? And one of the things, of course, I think is so interesting here is Lyon mounted a whole project about this with all kinds of people writing Where I'm From paragraphs or poems to her, right? To suggest that what we think of as a life narrative isn't necessarily a smooth narrative where one thing happens and then another happens, that there's chaos in there. And that kind of lived chaos and sometimes the beauty of that lived chaos is where we can start writing.
Right. Sometimes when I don't know if it's on the particular screen share because I'm on my phone, it's so little, but sometimes when I assign this project, I give students a task of, listing 5 things that are food from their childhood, 5 things that are music they listen to, 5 media things, and then 5 objects that were in their house when they're growing up. And then you get a lot of these really beautiful prose poems that are like, I am from microwaved craft dinner, from pierogies made on Sunday. And you can see how it puts image first again. So we're not doing that thing where we're telling or reflecting first. It's just it's like the symbol has to stand on its own there in some ways. So I like to use those kinds of small guiding prompts a little bit because it gets people's juices flowing.
And we have a list here where to go with where
Awesome.
I'm from and a way to start it, and actually other examples. So there's lots here. It's a really great little resource for people to start with. I'm going to stop sharing now because we're getting close to the end of our time. I just want to check the Q&A for a second. Oh, okay, that's good. Kara's writing, this talk has been phenomenal. Thank you so much. She's feeling inspired. And I'm going to pass it to you, Jenny, to wrap things up for us.
Yeah, I have some closing remarks, largely to thank you, Tanis, for this amazing conversation. I want to thank Nick and everyone at the Alumni Office, folks who've joined from Wilfrid Laurier and elsewhere, all of you who have attended.